Without further ado, I would like to ask Ines, my colleague here, to join at the panel, or actually to introduce the former Prime Minister, Igor Lukšić, to us and to the group, and who will give us a talk and also is ready for questions, because as we all know, he's very flexible, having been in politics and in education here at the university, or is still, and an entrepreneur. He knows what we need. Ines, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to introduce you our keynote speaker tonight, Mr. Igor Lukšić. He is a Montenegrin politician, as Barbara already told you, and he was a former Ministry of Finance during 2004 to 2008. He's also a former Prime Minister of Montenegro from 2010 to 2012, and a former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Montenegro from 2012 to 2016. He was nominated by the government of Montenegro for the position of the Secretary General of the United Nations, and currently he is working as a director of PricewaterhouseCoopers for Southeastern Europe. He's also a professor at the University of Donja Gorica. Professor, the floor is yours.
It's really a great pleasure to be with you tonight, and don't worry, because you see all these papers. I'm not going to deliver a written speech for many reasons. One of the reasons is obviously that I've naively accepted to talk at 6:30, which is just ahead of your dinner and party time. So I'm going to succeed if I keep you awake. So definitely I'm not going to talk too long. But what I'd like to offer is actually some introductory views, and hopefully provoke some questions or comments, because I'm really heartened to see, and I managed to listen to several project descriptions. I'm really heartened to see that there are people who really care about liberalism, but who actually act on supporting liberalism, because it's not enough to talk about it. And especially nowadays, there is so many people who actually like to criticize liberalism, who find all the answers to all the world problems by actually calling for protectionism or isolationism or closure of their societies, and so on and so on. So it's really great to see. And I'm sure that in all your societies, in all the countries you come from, you actually day by day continue to struggle for that, because it's definitely not easy to have currently buy-in of the people for this. And going back some years ago, when I took part in one of the free market roadshows, it was definitely a different landscape, politically, economically, from what we have today. It's actually amazing how many things have changed. And that's why I think that this is, or take this more as my view on the state of the liberalism in today's world. And in Europe, we are not doing particularly well. And even globally, we have certain issues. Currently, where we are, I liked this comment of a colleague from Lithuania, who invoked the memory of bananas being brought to Lithuania after the breakdown of the Soviet Union. Because I also remember bananas coming to Montenegro and what was then socialist Yugoslavia, but it was just before the collapse of Yugoslavia. So at least in your case, bananas were probably seen as a good portent of what future holds, or what future held back then. New age of liberalism, free market economy, and so on. For us and for many people nowadays in Montenegro, they remember those years as, okay, socialism was a shelter. And why don't we go back? Because transition has brought nothing but unemployment, destruction of factories, and so on and so on. And let's put it in a Trumpite sort of a word, a carnage to industry in these parts. So it is definitely not easy to discuss liberalism and liberal ideas nowadays when you have democracies pretty much shackled by the working of the different interest groups. You have a number of illiberal movements who tend to offer you solution to what today's society or model democracy should be. And on the other hand, you have actually a growing number of autocracies. And obviously the problem with autocracies is there's no freedom at all. There might be some economic freedom here and there, but generally it is an unstable combination. In the long run, it simply cannot work. So the problem with liberalism is that it is truly nowhere or marginally present. So, festivals like this, efforts like this, initiatives to talk about how to improve the state of liberty is really a beacon of hope and beacon of light in today's Europe. Going back to the years of the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, especially in Europe, you'll remember that back then, many people actually even invoked the Austrian School of economy to explain the problems of the then economies. Austrian business cycle, learning of Mises, learning of Hayek, and so on, to explain what stood behind the eruption of the crisis back in 2008. But interestingly enough, none of the solutions were Hayekian or Misesian. Basically, it was monetarist and Keynesian, or actually a combination of monetarist or Keynesian solutions. And even nowadays, we still have a lot of it in place. And I'll come back to that in a short while. So back then, solutions were, and we also, as I was then in government, back then I was finance minister, we were promoting a three approach policy of how to put our economy back to growth by doing three things. One was to face the issue of fiscal consolidation. The second was to talk about structural agenda, because that's where you gain competitiveness in the long run. And the third was to attract investments by improving your business environment. And I think we may agree that more or less that was the recipe that was implemented elsewhere, although the combination of those instruments or the structure of those instruments were probably unequally applied. So have we been successful in doing that? Or we have only moved one crisis to another? And nobody's still actually questioning whether we have really managed to sort out a structural agenda. Have we really improved fiscal balance, or have we really improved the business environment? Or we are only relying upon fresh liquidity pumped into the market. And I'll come back to that. In the meantime, political landscape is dramatically different. When you take a look at what has been going on in the European Union, either because of the several rounds of different political crises, or the issue of, which is a lot deeper and a lot more problematic, of the issue of identity of the EU. Today we are actually dealing with that. We have no solutions to that, to the issue of EU's identity. And plus, we've seen the first example of a country leaving EU, so Brexit, although we are yet to see what sort of the Brexit we're going to see, because Theresa May's decision to call for early election was actually an attempt to have probably robust support for her government in the Brexit talks. And there are different scenarios. We have pretty much deteriorated relationship to Russia, which affects also economies, and in a way creates a lot of issues for the EU inside. as there are different approaches, different countries, some very tired of those sanctions. You have also implications of that policy in different elections, including the French, where some candidates differ in terms also of their approach towards how to resolve the relation with Russia. South Mediterranean is burning due to that, and not only due to that, we had a migrant crisis, very, very complicated migrant crisis, but which also shows, and the way how to respond that, also shows the sentiment towards liberalism. Because I'm not saying that we should, just let millions of people go over the sea and come here. But at the same time, when you know that there are very detailed studies being done showing that if all the people who want to move globally really end up being at a different place where they want to be, global GDP can grow. Of course, it's impossible because of politics, because of barriers. So by wanting to close our societies, by lambasting migration, by putting blame on migrants for every local problem you have, we're actually also talking about the issue of liberalism. We're talking about one of the generators of free society, letting people move around the world and pursuing their wishes and in attempt to create their own wealth. There's also United States new administration, which in the early days have shown a lot of different approaches. Up to now, there's been an incredible U-turn from what was mentioned in the campaign to what we're seeing nowadays. I'm referring to foreign policy, where we are still yet to see what sort of the internal policies will be implemented. In the meantime, there's global trade, which is slowed down, and nobody talks about new free trade deals. Pacific one, dead. Atlantic, terminated. So the only free trade success has been EU-Canada. And even that one, it was very hard to push through, and there were a lot of concessions. So the question is, if we are really going to support free trade by having that agreement, or it's only called a free trade agreement? Is it going to really bring an added value? Globally also, we need to understand, from our European point of view, we need to understand that globally things have changed dramatically in past years. And interestingly enough, the most pro-globalization messages we now receive nowadays from China. When you take a look and give some scrutiny to Chinese President Davos' speech, it was pretty much pro-globalization, which you would not probably expect some years ago. And compared to everybody else who is a factor in today's world, it probably comes from unexpected door. But probably it also shows the changing of the leverage, because historically what Mediterranean was once, and then Atlantic in terms of free trade, it's Pacific Rim nowadays. That's where all things now globally take place. And unfortunately, even security tensions that take place there, which probably has led Henry Kissinger to talk about Asia today looking like Europe in early 20th century, might be a bit distressing, but it shows that the pendulum has definitely gone into that direction. There's also one more thing which needs to be taken into account. And it was quite interesting, and I'm glad that in certain way I also took part in it. A couple of years ago, 2 years ago, in the United Nations New York session, there was the adoption of SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030. Very complex agenda, probably impossible to implement, and especially in the next 15 years. But at least it is for the first time that countries got together, managed to cross their interests, and we really had a sort of a bottom-up approach in defining such a very complex and comprehensive agenda. We talk about 17 goals, but we are also talking about 169 targets. The problem is that different people, different characters, depending on what sort of values you want to apply, will in a different way interpret the goals. Because I believe that unless there is actually more liberalism, more free trade, more public-private sector schemes and so on, there is no way to implement sustainable development goals. But probably a vast majority of people will think that, okay, it should be government-driven, it should be budget-driven or whatever sort of an approach, and plus rich countries should just transfer enough money and in a way equalize the issue of income or distribution of income, issue of development and so on. But this is still a very important development that we need to take into account, given the strategically important approach that has been taken. Coming back to an issue that can pretty much paint our immediate, but not only immediate, but mid to long run future in Europe, and it is the French election. For different reasons. Some weeks ago, it looked like an election that we're going to have a competition between ultranationalist proponent of a closure approach, and the other side, a younger candidate, someone who promotes open societies. But now it's not really certain anymore. And as you know, there's a possibility of ending up in a second round to choose between ultranationalist and a communist. Can you imagine a situation of a country very important, a cradle of enlightenment in Europe, to end up in that sort of a choice? And it, for sure, it will have effect, all of us. So we need to take into account. But I guess one of the conclusions to draw is an obvious environment or background being drawn, that political environment is not really any longer divided between those who are on the left or the right and so on. But we are now talking about political landscape because which divides the court between those who are pro-open and those who want to close. Another thing that we need to take into account is one of the most important megatrends that are that develops as we live. 50 years ago, in our world, there was 2 billion people. Today there's 7 billion people. And in 2050, we're going to have 10 billion people. It's going to be a dramatic change. But Europe will remain more or less the same. Will not really grow so much unless we allow the inflow to continue. How that will affect what are daily lives, and I think it will affect a lot, because if we're going to if we're going to be able to sustain that process and sort of absorb that process, then where does it end? I mean, what is it we're going to do? Is a solution if we're going to to close our European societies? Are we going to build a sort of a walled-in continent, or are we going to robotize our societies to the maximum. Maybe we're going to use IT or technology growth for some of the solutions and so on and so on. But it's really very questionable. Things change also dramatically in that aspect as well. And the question is if it is going to really a chance for rebirth of liberalism, or it is really a big danger for liberalism in the future world. Right now, if you ask me, I think it is like half-half. For those of you who sometimes watched Doctor Who series, there are interesting characters there. You may know of those Oods, and they have two brains. One is what they keep in their head, and the other one they hold in hand. And maybe it was a sort of a portent of smartphones, I don't know. But today I read that Zuckerberg from Facebook, he already talks about smartphones will get obsolete very soon. He talks about augmented reality, whatever that is. Sort of augmented reality. Artificial intelligence, makes strides. It was fascinating to see that whatever it's called, DeepMind or whatever, beating a guy in that famous Asian game very recently, which is a game which is more complex than chess, and chess is already very complex. So everything, and that seems to be my feeling. Everything that we used to watch in science fiction movies 10 or 20 years ago, all of a sudden it happens. So whatever you manage to imagine, probably it will happen. So rest assured. But how does it affect? How does it affect? Are we able to cope? Europe today, again, this is still European Resource Bank meeting. Europe today and the region we belong to here, we are faced with a lot of issues. And in the long run, it's really structural agenda we have a deep problem with. And this is a sort of a crossroad. Which path we're going to take? Coming back, as I promised, to monetarist or Keynesian or combination of monetarist and Keynesian solution to the financial crisis from 2008, 2009 has led into our economies being splashed with incredible amount of computer-generated money. And for the time being, nobody probably sees an issue with that, and everybody seems to be happy because all of a sudden, and IMF recently also declares, okay, we are probably entering the period of another growth of economy and so on and so on. And inflation has only started to pick up, which everybody is very happy about and so on. But if you take into account increase of stocks or increase of real estate prices, we may again invoke Austrian explanation of the big crisis or depression that happened in the roaring 20s. Because back then as well, inflation was not that high. I mean, usual monetary measure. But back then also, stocks going up, real estate prices going up, and so on. And then all of a sudden, there was a problem. So, are we going to have something like that again? So soon after 5 or 10 years, since we had depression or big recession last time, and what the solution will be then? A hard question. Or maybe easy question, but hard decisions for those who end up in such a situation. Because I witnessed that. I was in Washington attending IMF World Bank meeting in 2008. It was October. It was just weeks after Lehman Brothers went down. Hungary was desperate to get some money and so on. And you could feel fear. You could see fear in those people, in people's eyes. And if something like that happens again so soon, I mean, it's a true question. So I think the only solution is in brave decision makers who will be able to have guts and promote liberalism, liberal ideas, liberal economic policy. Is it going to happen? It's hard to bet. I'm quite happy to be referred to as former politician, so I can be more comfortable and more flexible in what I say. And probably if I came here as an actual politician, I would say, yes, we have power, we have enthusiasm, we have vision, and so on. Now, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. At the same time, economically speaking, at the microeconomy level, there's actually interesting trend of less new people, entrepreneurial new people getting set up. And industries are getting more concentrated. Even in America, I mean, it's a huge market. 2/3 of industries are less competitive than they were in 70s. Big IT companies take over or just buy or whatever. Every micro company that may bring some creative destruction, so to speak, in order to stifle potential future competition. And if we have shackled politicians because of pressure groups and populism, and only calculating what comes next, I mean in terms of election, some election, and on the other hand, if there's less and less creative destruction, so it's a problem. And then IT progress we're talking about may actually weigh towards less liberalism, less openness, more danger for liberalism in the future. So I think we need to take that into account. As far as this region is concerned, number of issues pertain. One of the problems we still have is brain drain. Fortunately, it is a brain drain. And I'm not sure we're doing enough to keep skillful people around. A lot of skillful young people think about leaving this region against possibilities they have in, Germany, elsewhere in Europe, United States, Canada. So that is really and indeed an issue. It is probably because of one missing link. Because transition in these parts was only halfway through. It's relatively easy to change political system. You introduce multi-party system, and then they compete, and some party wins, some party loses, some parties win, some party loses, and so on. We did a lot in terms of opening and liberalizing our economies, privatizing economies, and so on. But unfortunately, we've done least in terms of values, development a new set of values. That's the issue. That's how problem comes back through a back door. And the longer it takes to develop new set of values, the costs of transition are growing higher and higher. And that is really a question. Does EU help? I think European integration process for the region is vital because of the weaknesses of our countries. Among different options you can pick, this one should be the best option. These are small markets, small countries. You should be able to get access to huge market. You should be able to enjoy all those freedoms and so on. But with the state of the EU currently, and for example, the recent speech of President of the European Commission talking about the future EU, where he presented 4 or 5 scenarios, I'm not really sure, because it is up to analysts to propose scenarios. And it's politicians who have vision and make decisions. It's awkward if you have a politician offering scenarios. Plus, the problem for countries in this region is there was no single word, no mention about enlargement, about consolidating EU, about expanding EU, and so on and so on. So probably the easiest way is, okay, to continue dishing out some money through instrument for pre-accession, help some technical advice. Maybe there's some money which will go to infrastructure, although I think there's a big infrastructure hole in this region, and EU should be a lot more proactive in helping that, because IT can help, jump over some stages of development, but unless there is physical infrastructure, there's really no solution. But even that, I'm not sure if it is really done in a proper way, because we're talking about the lack of administrative skills. Because if we're talking about a boost to liberalism, liberal economic policy, if we're talking about structural agenda, if we're talking about business improvement, business environment improvement, and so on, fiscal consolidation, those are policy measures. There should be some vision behind. Unfortunately, we seem to be sort of bogged down in different technocratic approaches, where we compare what to do and what really technical solutions should be, how to meet some benchmark, and so on. And at the end of the process, at the end of the day, maybe formally we may meet some benchmarks, but we will never really develop administrative skills, administrative capacity, because we need to be aware that our public administration, which is really crucial and important lever in the process, will never really be able to compete, and will probably never be able to meet the level of the quality of ever improving British or some other civil administration in Europe. So we need to look for other solutions. We need to be able to combine public and private. We need to be able to open up, think out of box, so to speak, in order to make sure that we give boost to this process we want to see, and encourage those who are ready to promote liberal ideas against those, and there are so many, including so many young people who are more radical, who are fundamentalist, who think the solution is in closing, in ethnical distance, and so on and so on. So there's a lot of work for all those liberals in years and decades to come. As always, it has never been a done deal, quite the contrary. And again, this for me, it's been really a great possibility to take part in European Resource Bank meeting, and I hope I've kept you awake. Thank you so much. Yes, please.
Questions?
So thank you for the speech, and I have one question. Do you think that the current events in the EU and the Euro crisis, so to say, could hinder the efforts of the Montenegro to join the EU? I mean, it's been discussed that this could happen around 2021, but do you think this is realistic, and do you think that the current events could endanger this perspective?
Well, yes and no. I think no, because it's still up to us. I think if our society is able to respond to most of the benchmarks, criteria, and so on, then I think the pressure can be built to rethink any decision, including the one to suspend enlargement for the time being. The trouble is that the process of integrating grows more and more complex. Today, it's a lot more complex than it was 10 or 15 years or 20 years ago. Because back then, it was also part of a grand vision. Now it's very much technocratic. And today's enlargement strategy talks about three pillars. One is rule of law criteria, second one is economic governance criteria, third one is public administration reform. Basically, it mixes the same, towards the same goal, but these are three sort of pillars. And if we are able to respond to all those challenges, then I think there will be still a lot of advocates to help the process. But in parallel to that, we need to be aware that due to all these events, and it is still uncertain what sort of the course of action EU will take, and which scenario or mix of scenarios will be really implemented. I remember, was it 10 or 15 years ago, but even actually more recent than that, multi-speed European Union, or EU in few speeds, so to speak, was pretty much rejected because the argument, well, no cherry picking, should be one size for all, and that's it. Nowadays, however, we hear a lot of voices who argue that there should be a different concept and a change of a concept. That we need to probably think of core integration, then the second circle, then associate members to reach out to this or that potential aspirant. So it is still unclear if we are going to be able to remain in this train that leads to the membership. I heard the other day at one meeting from a person who has certain role in the EU system, that person believes that probably Montenegro and actually Albania have bigger chance. Other countries from this region, it's very hard for this or that reason. Because, for example, unless Serbia and Kosovo formulate to the fullest their relationship, nobody will import a country where you're really not sure what your borders are, and EU will not let it. The same is with some of other aspirants in the region. So whether that is really true reflection or not, well, the time will tell. But I think yes, to the extent, and to finally give final answer to yes, to the extent that we are able to meet our liabilities.
Alex, and then Richard, and then Ken.
I come from the country that has broken all the rules in order to become a member of the European Union. I'm Greek, and has been given all the favors in return. I want to ask you, one of the things that has, as people who work in the think tank and the battle of ideas here, many of us, we're very concerned about the battle of ideas and the integration process when local politicians don't own the necessary free market reforms that need to happen in order to gain accession to the European Union. We witnessed in many different countries, not only Greece, that the reaction is a rise in nationalism combined with a very unhealthy skepticism towards reforms rather than the institutions demanding it. Do you see that in Montenegro, and do you have a response to that observation?
Well, what I see, I don't know if it answers to your question, but what I see in this region is tendency to push whatever reforms we're talking about, to push reforms only at the really last moment and if you're pressed. Which also shows that there is no vision, as a background, because the point is to formulate the concept of vision and then deliver. I think in Montenegro we had one very, I think it was a great experience. And now as I compare different stages of reforms in Montenegro, as you know, 2006 there was a referendum on independence, which we won. But I think the government from 2002-3 to 2006 was the most reform-oriented government we ever had, for different reasons. and I'm referring to economic reforms. It was thanks to the fact that we had a competent team led by Professor Vukotic back then, who helped together with foreign experts put together agenda of economic reforms. We had the full backing of the government, prime minister, and so on, and different ministers who delivered, I included, in different forms and pushing different reforms. Comparing to what we see today, we must have been really totally nuts, because you want to push all the reforms, change all your society, make all those difficult decisions, and win a referendum. You think that today somebody will be able to push for all those reforms, and then in 2 or 3 years wait for elections just calmly, and no way. That's when. But we won, of course. We won, and everything else what started to unfold. What I'm trying to point out is this vision is so important. And many even today, there are so many people who love Margaret Thatcher. I'm really respectful. Maybe she made certain mistakes, but I appreciate what she did. Not really only because of being in the position to talk to Hayek on some ideas and so on before she took power, but because she was never shy to claim that she was a conviction politician, that she had a grand vision to transform British society. And instead of going backwards after her successors actually continued. Adding some elements, so on, probably adjusting to the environment. But she was so strong. So that's what we need. If you ask me if it is possible to have that sort of leaders in nowadays Europe, I'm not sure. And it's not only because of a character of those leaders, but it's also because of social networks. It's also because of IT, because of we have access to interest groups. Actually, can use all that to be very strong and lobby for their ideas. So that's why one of the reasons why I wouldn't be fully optimistic about the future of liberalism, if we're going to prevail or not.
Richard, and then last question by Kate.
Thank you very much for a very interesting speech. I'm just going to take two ideas which I found great. You're probably one of the few liberals left, especially those who have been in politics, who still come out so strongly in favor of free movement of people and migration. The second thing you touched upon, and you said you were on the fence whether the Keynesian policies will lead to another crisis very shortly after the last one. I'm a little bit more fearful with regard to that. But one of the things that did happen in the 1920s is that the second crash led to another wave of economic people moving from one country to another. The third thing, of course, being in favor of migration in a country that has a huge brain drain is a little bit of a two-sided sword. So I wonder if you could elaborate on these positions.
Yeah, the issue of brain drain has been, in a way endemic, not only Montenegro, in the whole region. I think historically, we've been a country where people have for centuries left to either somewhere in the region, or Europe, or United States, or Argentina, South Africa, and so on and so on, for different reasons. But main reason was this was a poor country. People didn't want to starve and die of hunger, and then they were deciding to go elsewhere. So in the past 10 or 15 years, especially after independence, I think we managed to cut the process and even had reverse. But unfortunately, everything that goes on, and it's some of those factors are really out of our control, and outside factors have led probably to the continuation of this process. We'll see what future holds for us in those terms. But at the same time, if we're going to develop, if this country is going to develop, and I remember being in government and having different debates about this. For example, as one of European standards, the people from Labour Ministry, for example, were always mindful of and interested to impose some restrictions on free labour movement, quotas and so on and so on. And I kept asking, okay, right now there is several real estate huge projects taking place in Montenegro, which, if carried out properly, should generate tens of thousands of jobs. I mean, who is going to work in those hotels unless we open up our borders for people from the region? And are we, as a society, ready to open up our schools and find out one day that my kids share the classroom with like 20 people from not only region, maybe even farther than our region, maybe South Mediterranean and so on, because there's cheaper labor. Are we? I mean, and then you put to test the vitality of true liberal approach in a society. I'm referring to Montenegro, but it can be referred to any other country in this region. And also the issue, I'm quite certain in this region is not about microeconomy and companies. And I think the issue, real troublemaker, is public finances, macrofinancial management, and so on, and in countries in this region, public debt, which has been accumulated for this or that reason. And that it really stifles further growth. You cannot cut taxation and so on. Montenegro has been pretty much often cited as a country where tax regime is pretty good, with 9% tax income, corporate income tax, or 9% personal income tax. But when you take into account all the taxation, then you realize you're not so competitive. When you compare with OECD, yes, we are somewhere in average, but we're in average because in Belgium it's a horror, whereas in Malta or some other countries it's much lower than we are, and then we're not really competitive, because it's not only about taxation, it's parafiscal, it's about social contributions, and then and it's pretty much the same in our region. So unless we are able to change the approach, microeconomy, companies, firms, entrepreneurs will continue to suffer. And we're going to end up celebrating Liberty Day deeper and deeper in a year. And that's obviously a bad thing.
Thank you for your remarks. It struck me that one of the most powerful statements you made was that these days the most pro-globalization messages that you hear come from China. And then you described a minister at Davos, I believe. And I wonder if you could comment on the depth in the import and how powerful it is for people here to hear about pro-globalization messages from non-government actors. So you referenced Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook, and the brain drain. So these people are being recruited or attracted to European-based companies or universities, and they're getting other globalization messages. And I wonder how the balance works out for the governmental messages versus the market messages.
Well, honestly, if I understand correctly your question, honestly, I don't think that people really pay attention enough to all that. And unfortunately, the state of our society, but when I talk about Montenegro, I also mean other countries in the region, because we share more or less cultural pattern. And not there yet. Unfortunately, we are so constrained to day-to-day issues, and daily politics take so much attention and so on. So if it's going to change, then it will change gradually, and it takes concentrated effort. But again, concentrated effort means there's some engineering in behind, and I don't see it. So it'll have to be spontaneous, and then based on some people who have vision to act. You're in one place like that, because it was some days ago. I think this is the only institution that I think even in the region that organized a roundtable speaking about this university in 2050. So not only 2030 but 2050. Trying to understand where we are, what we do, how we really educate properly our students. Do we educate enough ourselves? And I was able to listen to a lot of bright and smart people talking about really, really great things. But the problem is, it is not overwhelming, it's not a prevailing approach. And due to probably different reasons. It will be too easy to judge. But going back to globalization, interestingly enough, but if we when you hear all those messages day after day, and when you look at, for example, Brexit referendum results, and you find out that about the structure of the people who managed to cast votes and ended up with 1% in favor of Brexit. Pretty much in that structure there was a lot of elderly people, as opposed to majority of young people who probably didn't turn out in high figures, but those who turned out, majority of them were in favor of Britain staying in EU, interconnecting, and so on and so on. That's why it's strange to find out that instead of Europe or United States, Western world, leading on this globalization process, because I think all those, even Islamic State or populism or other different kinds of forms and shapes they take, in a way, I believe it is all sort of a resistance to globalization. And I think it's unstoppable. We may try to suspend it for a few years, but I think it will come back, because it's a global market, a global world, interconnected, and definitely there's no way to suspend it. So what worries me, actually, opposed to those majority of young people in Great Britain that wanted Britain to stay in the EU, is that in these parts, I'm not sure how young people are really progressive. That's what I'm concerned with. And if we, in an analysis, end up in thinking, because I'm not sure if the place you are is really fully representative to understand the mindset of young people. So if you because had you decided to organize somewhere else, some other university, God forbid, go to philosophical faculty in Lukšić, I'm not sure what sort of a response you would get. I'm talking about Montenegro, but there's a lot of similarities in other countries in the region. So if you end up realizing that younger people 10 or 20 years ago were more progressive than the ones you talk to nowadays, then it's trouble. And unfortunately, they are under pressure from different NGOs, from different politicians, different religious leaders, and so on, who send messages, let's say, not very progressive ones. And obviously, it affects the way of thinking, it affects public opinion, it affects the way institutions work, it affects the setting up and implementation of a vision you want to back, and so on and so on. I don't know if this answers to your question. Maybe I've ventured into totally different direction, but it's probably it's a habit I developed because of my previous jobs.
Well, thank you very much, Igor, and thank you for those open words. And I think since we are all libertarians and we believe in innovation and creativity, we are all positive. And I think we should hope for the best and not, look at the difficulties, but look ahead and think that we can manage and we can make it. And what you have made here in Montenegro, what you have made happen, is a very, very good example for many other parts of the world. So I would not see it as negative and as critical as you do. I think you have done a fabulous job, and we in Austria can learn from the reforms that you have undergone. So I think we should take all these messages home to our other European countries, that there is there is a country, a nation that is proud and independent and knows exactly where to head. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.